Hi, and welcome back to my channel for another episode. I'm making episodes now. I have lighting. I have depth of field. I'm working on. What can I say I'm working on? But I wanted to address a question which raises its head from time to time, simply because, people obviously wonder, and in certain parameters, you can't wonder about something you haven't heard. That question, of course, being, are audiophile pressings better than the original pressings? I can only speak to jazz releases. Even though I do have a lot of rock releases, I have almost every form and pressing of Beatles records, including the most recent Sgt. Pepper White Album and Abbey Road mixes. That's a whole nother ball of wax. But I really wanted to address this whole idea that I've seen out there on the intrawebs, that audiophile pressings are better than the original pressings. And some people making blanket statements as to that, like it's fact or something. Audiophile pressings aren't better than original pressings. Original pressings aren't better than audiophile pressings. They are definitely different. As Joe Harley said in my last interview with him, he has tons of original pressings, and he listens to them before he remasters with Kevin Gray to sort of get an angle on what he's going to do and refamiliarize himself with the records. And the thing about Rudy Van Gelder is we're talking about a very long time period that he worked, from the mid-50s up into the late 1960s. He started with a mono, then he went to 2-channel, and by the end of it all, he was into multi-track. Yeah, he goes later in the early 70s. He just wasn't doing Blue Note, I think, or Blue Note wasn't doing him. But he kept on recording. The photos you see of him with the multi-track, he's in the 70s and the 80s. Englewood Cliffs is still a working studio, now run by Don Sickler and Margaret Sickler, I believe. Margaret was Rudy's assistant, and he handed off all his knowledge and everything to her, not Don, but her. And it's still a working studio. And the thing about Rudy was, as you probably well know, he was constantly experimenting. And you can hear that through all the recordings. You hear it not so much in the Hackensack period when he first got started, which are some of my favorite recordings because they're so warm and intimate. And you can see photos where it looks like the guys are in a living room, which essentially they are, even though he built that for a professional studio as well. But after that, at Englewood Cliffs, he's constantly experimenting, and you can hear that all over the place. That's why sometimes Elvin Jones' drums are phasing like crazy, the cymbals, because the pots, the volume, the sliders on the board weren't high enough, so they're phasing because the mics can't handle it. I believe that's the correct way to look at it. Or he was trying, he was always working with piano sounds, because in the early days, before they put up separate rooms at Englewood Cliffs, everybody was in the same room together, so he was trying to make sure that things didn't bleed into the piano. That seemed to be a big challenge for him. But even beyond that, all the records, take 5 Rudy Van Gelder records, even recorded in the same period, and to me they all sound kind of different. It's strange. Joe kind of put to bed the idea that he was moving his mics all around the time, that it was a secret. This was a working studio. He was looking for ways to get the best possible sound, and then he cut the records for the players of those days, just like Kevin and Joe are cutting records for today's much better players that can handle bass and have more high-frequency extension. But as far as the idea of audiophile pressings being better than all original pressings, first of all, you have to know what original pressings sound like. You have to have heard, quite a few original pressings. And then we get down to the whole thing of, who can get original pressings anyway? Well, I'm lucky. I'm blessed. I work at the store. We have hundreds of original pressings. And even on the So-So system at home, there's something very special about an original Blue Note pressing, or an original Prestige pressing, or an original Impulse pressing, all Rudy Van Gelder product. He also did classical records. He was a real whiz. And the interesting thing is, every label he did, and CTI is vastly different from Blue Note, but they all have a different sound. I think part of that is whoever the producer was there wanted a certain sound, but also Rudy was experimenting all the time. So, but back to the idea, I have a few like Lexington era first pressings, and nothing sounds like that. Nothing. They had a sense of dynamics, a sense of space, a sense of energy. They're really special, and they're more than like a museum piece. On a really good system, and I have a really good system, they sound wonderful. And audiophile pressings sound wonderful too, but your Tone Poets and your Music Matters and your classic vinyl records all sound much, much more alike than those pressings sounded alike when they first came out. There was Verve Vital vinyl, which some of those sounded wonderful, but there don't seem to be that many, or they're waiting to be repressed. As Joe said in our interview, there are like 15 or 20 titles of Tone Poets waiting to be repressed. But back to the original idea. First of all, you have to have heard original pressings, New York pressings, 47 West 63rd pressings, Liberty pressings, UA pressings. And as long as there's a Van Gelder stamp on it, all those pressings can sound pretty fantastic. And it's one thing to just, make a claim and everybody has an opinion, but you have to listen, opinions are based on whatever experience you have. And I'm not saying that I'm some genie or I'm some special person. I came to the city as a musician. I've been poor most of my life here. I was lucky enough to work at Jazz Record Center and just fall into it. And I've learned so much working there. With the modern pressings, the modern system, as Joe said, they can reveal the true bass that was on the tapes. And sometimes there isn't a whole lot of bass on the tape, but it's probably more natural overall. They're not trying to create a bass bump like Rudy did to give the impression of bass. And, Rudy also made the horn spicy by pushing the upper mid-range. That's why the horns have so much drive. But there are other factors involved as well. It's not just either or. And I don't know what that is. I don't know why it is. But I've done my own ABs here. I've talked about them. I mean, even in the last week, I compared a Van Gelder UA Kenny Burrell Midnight Blue to the new classic vinyl Midnight Blue. And to me, there was no contest. The new reissues, including Midnight Blue, they're surgically clean. They're pretty dynamic. They have better bass, if there's bass on the session to begin with. Sometimes there isn't. Very spatial, definitely more detail, more resolution. I don't think the sound stages are any better. But on that particular comparison I did, the original UA pressing, and that's the end of the line, many stampers later, sounded more like real music. It's a bigger sound stage, bigger imaging. It filled the room, it hard charged the room, and it was no contest. It was just like, wow. Now it wasn't as precise. Each instrument wasn't finely layered. Each image wasn't perfectly carved in space as much as the reissue, but it sounded more like flesh and blood music. And I knew it right away. It was just like, wow, I was surprised. But then on the other hand, just the other day, and this was my last video, I compared the All-Seeing Eye, my UA Van Gelder pressing, to the new Tone Poet, and the Tone Poet was just clearly better in every regard. There was more warmth. Seemed to have a lower noise floor. There was much more space around the instruments. Sounded more natural, more cohesive, and that's like a large ensemble. So perhaps in that environment, it really benefited by being able to hear everything that's on the tape. Again, the whole idea of what is better, what is your definition of better? Young audiophiles, people who are just getting into the audiophile hobby, never mind people who don't care about that, they're usually really, what they want to hear is more detail, more resolution. That tells them this is a better amplifier, better speaker. It has more detail, more resolution. But after a while, you realize that's really not what it's all about. There's something more organic and holistic at play here. And also the fact that the tapes are not 50 years old when they first cut the original pressings. Even a UA pressing, at the most, is like 7 years after the tape has been cut. But my Shindo tube gear is nowhere near as resolving as my Air amp, definitely not as resolving or as detailed as the Technics amp I had, and those are incredible sound staging machines and spatial beast, none of which the Shindo has. My Shindo amplification costs about 20 grand total, but you're listening to tubes, old tubes, new old stock, point-to-point wiring, no circuit boards. Everything is a direct line. It's like working together like a holistic system, and it's all connected, and it's all sort of burned in. I don't know the theory behind any of that. But a tube amplifier, a well-made tube amplifier, like a modern-day tube amp from Now, Prima Luna is all point-to-point wiring. Those are great amps. There's more tone, there's more true realistic tone, and there's better texture. That has never been matched for anything I've reviewed compared to my Shindo. And that figures into what you want to hear in a pressing. Do you just want to hear detail? There's a lot more than detail. You know, there's an organicness in a really great record, whether it's the original or the remastered. A while ago, I compared the Tone Poet, Now He Sings, Now He Sobs, to my original Solid State, and the Tone Poet had bigger sound stage, it was bigger, definitely had more details, more dynamic, but it lacked this sort of woody, organic, very natural whole. And that's the thing that we get with digital, that we get with Solid State compared to analog, and vinyl is an analog medium. That sense of wholeness and authenticity and realism and naturalness. Right now I'm playing the Forte 4 speakers. A friend wanted to hear them, and they're not as resolving, they don't have as good a tone or texture as my DeVore Fidelity speakers, which were a much more refined instrument. But the Fortes have so much life and they're so dynamic, and it's a similar sort of thing. I'd rather hear tone, texture, dynamics. I mean, the DeVores are very dynamic, it's just a very different speaker, and something that's hard to identify all the time. But in saying all of that, it's getting harder and harder to find, never mind an original pressing, like a third or fourth pressing. Liberty pressings are going up, and people are hoarding them, and they're really, really hard to find. But I personally, just when I hear someone say, oh, audiophile pressings are all better than the originals, it drives me nuts. I've heard all these things, I've compared all these things, I've reviewed gear for 30 years, and I'm an old guy, and jazz is a big part of my life. You know, I moved here as a jazz musician, and, you know, it's a big part of who I am. And so I take umbrage to these things when somebody says audiophile pressings are better than the original pressings, because I've heard these things. And it's an either-or, case-by-case situation is the point I'm trying to make here. They're all different. I mean, even with Rudy Van Gelder, I have mono pressings and stereo pressings of the same record. I don't know which one was. Some of them it's obviously better, and some of them like, wow, I really like the stereo and I like the mono. It's a case-by-case thing, because Rudy was, you know, doing stuff all the time. And as Joe Harley said, you know, in a roundabout way, their mastering chain, whatever it is, whoever is mastering records, that imbues the final sound with something. The sound of that mastering chain, the compression, the limiting, even if they don't do anything, it's running through equipment. Same thing with Rudy. So that, to me, that's why there's a uniformity of all the Tone Poets, of all the music matters, and it's a very lush, beautiful, full sound. It's impossible not to like on the great majority of systems, as where second and third pressings of Rudy's records, even originals, all kind of sound different, because he's always experimenting, he's doing different things, except for the Hackensack recordings, which are uniformly the same. They're more like contemporary recordings, the label, because they're all very, very uniform. But after that, you know, he's constantly moving around, and just, I don't know what all the scenarios are to why so many Blue Notes sound different. For my money, some of them are better. Even a UA Van Gelder. I used to think, oh, people would say, oh, as long as it's got a Van Gelder, it's okay. I used to go, I don't know about that, but I think that's true, because it still has whatever Rudy did to make that record magic. So please don't just assume that all audiophile pressings are better than all originals, or originals are all better than audiophile pressings. You know, this takes, if you're listening, it takes a while to hear all these things, develop all these things. The better your system is, the more resolving, well, not the more resolving, the more you can hear of the pressings, be they new or old pressings. And keep your pressings clean and keep your records flat. I just set up the new debut Carbon from Project. Pro debut Carbon, whatever, it's their latest anniversary table. It is really something, just out of the gate. I'm playing this reissue of Jimi Hendrix, and before that I was playing on the Kuzma. And I can tell it's a little untamed and a little unbridled and a little wild and woolly, but boy, it has a ton of energy and it sounds really nice. There's a moving magnet cartridge on it, and the platter is surprisingly heavy for a turntable that costs about $1,200. Anyway, thank you so much for today's rant. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and that is mine. And that's the way it is. Bye-bye.